Welcome to what will be, for many of you, your introduction to modernism. In this lecture, we'll talk through some of the social, cultural, political, economic, and other backgrounds for the aesthetic movement we call modernism. It's important to note that we are using two similar terms here, modernism and modernity. Modernity is the name for the historical period, which is usually dated 1880 to the present. In your research, you may encounter the term early modernism. This term refers to Shakespeare's time, not to the kind of modernism we are discussing in this course. Modernism is the name for the aesthetic movement that took place during the opening years of modernity, from about 1890 to 1940 or so. It includes architecture, painting, literature, music, and all the arts. The people who lived during the time of modernity saw their era as fundamentally different from historical eras that had existed in the past. They theorized their era, trying to understand what was different from before. Some scholars call this the break with the past, the idea that things were so different in modernity that people had to come up with new ways to understand what it was like to be human in that time. Some things characterize modernity. Industrialization was fully fledged by the time of modernity. Industrialization, the movement of manufacturing away from handwork done in rural areas to machine work done in large central factories, had begun in the 18th century. But by the early 20th century, that movement was mature. Factories used assembly lines to manufacture uniform goods, and workers generally did not see final products, only their step in the manufacturing process. Urbanization was the first cousin of industrialization. During the 18th century, in addition to the rise of industry, English society also took some steps to make rural life less sustainable. The main move along this front was enclosure of the commons. In small towns, some part of the local land had been held in common for the whole community. On this pasture land, smallholders or people who grew cash crops or who had businesses in the village would graze cows, sheep, and chicken, among other livestock. This common land allowed people who either did not own farmland or who needed farmland for cash crops to have enough food for their tables. With the rise of industrialization, the commons were enclosed or fenced and were restricted to the use of rich people, depriving ordinary people of an important addition to their livelihood. As a result, many people, starting with the children of the established villagers, moved to cities to take work in factories. We should note that this was a severe economic disruption. Factories didn't have to pay living wages because people were desperate, and so people went from living strenuous but comfortable lives to being undernourished and living in squalid conditions in factory towns and cities. Modernity wasn't all bad, of course. As people moved off the land and into cities, the franchise, the right to vote, expanded, first to workers who didn't own land, and eventually even to women, though that didn't happen until after World War I. Modernity was also the moment when the great empires of the 17th through 19th centuries began to dissolve. Some countries, Britain being the most obvious example of this, had spent the preceding centuries building up empires around the world. We've all heard the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that was very true in the 19th century. Britain had imperial possessions in North America, South America, Africa, India, East Asia, and of course Australia and New Zealand, along with other island possessions. By the beginning of the 20th century, Britain had held its oldest possession, Ireland, for some 600 years. Many of the places ruled by Britain wanted independence, and so, during the time of modernity, Britain faced constant challenges to its power, and many nations, including Ireland, finally gained self-rule. Among the things that made moderns feel that their time was different from the past was the rapid and increasing rate of change. We are used now to the idea that every year a new phone comes out with new features, even if a lot of the time the phone really isn't all that different from the one last year. But in the time of modernity, Because of industry and scientific discovery, totally new things were coming into being all the time. The airplane changed transportation, as did the invention of the automobile. The wireless radio changed communication. Now people could find out immediately what was happening in distant parts of the globe, and so the world felt smaller than it had in the past. The fact that things were changing so fast made people feel alienated from the world, just as factory work alienated workers from the products of their labor. Think about growing up in a world where news from India took weeks to reach you in England, and then suddenly being able to hear about events in India as they were happening. It's disorienting enough for us to buy a new dishwasher, and suddenly we have to use Wi-Fi and an app to turn it on. For the people of the early 20th century, these disruptions were happening every day, whereas their parents had lived in a world very much like their grandparents' world. Technological innovation is clearly behind the rapid rate of change, and transportation was a major area of innovation. The railroad had developed in the 19th century and made journeys that used to take several days into something that could happen in a few hours. Ships began to use oil fuel instead of coal. It was lighter and more energy dense and required less manpower to use. Of course, the airplane and automobile were invented during the time of modernity, and cities developed transit systems that included buses and subway trains as well as streetcars. The world got a lot smaller. Communications technology was another area of innovation. The telephone enabled people to talk to others at a distance. It was also an early news network. Telephones back in the day were all on what we call party lines. Each house had a special ring, so you could know it was your phone and not someone else's that was asking for an answer. And during news events, switchboard operators in each town or village would just ring all the phones, then announce whatever the news was. We talked about alienation a bit above. It's important to recognize that this technology was both unifying, everyone got the news at once, and alienating. Everyone got the news privately in their own house, instead of flocking to the village square to hear the announcement as they used to do. Cinema was invented during the time of modernity, and modernity also saw big changes in the industry, culminating in talkies and color films. Cinema allowed people to see distant events because newsreels would be shot in far-off locations, then screened in local theaters before the feature film. Because people hadn't had moving pictures before, cinema had to develop a syntax so that people could understand what was happening. A key problem for cinema in those early days was displaying simultaneity, that is, showing that while something was happening in one location, something else was happening elsewhere. At first, people's eyes and minds were not adapted to cinema's new conventions, but eventually people began to feel at ease with the new art form. Consumer goods also changed people's lives. Think about how it would feel to grow up in a world where, to get a new shirt, you had to raise some flax, harvest it and turn it into thread, weave it into cloth, and finally sew a shirt. Then, within a few years, you lived in a world where, when you wanted a shirt, you went to a store where shirts were stocked in various sizes to approximately fit most bodies that came in. Instead of using your own labor to make the things you needed, you earned wages that you then exchanged for necessities. Of course, alienation accompanied this shift. Workers were alienated from the products of their labor and also alienated from the things they bought with their money. This brings us to Stephen Kern's definition of simultaneity, which you will need to use for your informal essay. Kern defined simultaneity this way: the ability to experience many distant events at the same time, made possible by wireless and dramatized by the sinking of the Titanic, was a major change in the experience of the present. We need to unpack this a little bit. Things have always been going on at the same time all over the world. While we eat breakfast, people in another time zone are going to bed. While a big news event happens in the United States, another may be happening on the other side of the globe. What Kern is singling out as different is that in modernity, people could experience what was happening elsewhere. They could hear about the eruption of a volcano in Russia as they sat down to their bacon and eggs. Kern argues that this ability meant that people felt differently about time itself. The present became something to explain and understand instead of something we all just took for granted. Kern emphasizes the word experience in this quotation because he is focused not just on technological change, but on what that change did to people's feelings about being a person alive during this technological change. So what modernist artists were primarily concerned with then is this same change to people's feelings about being alive, consciousness. Consciousness is the state of being self-aware. It's what Descartes was interested in when he said, "I think, therefore I am." For the moderns, consciousness was the key mystery to explore. They wanted to capture in art what it feels like to be a thinking person, one who takes in the world around them, has memories, and tries to make sense of reality. The moderns realize that we all take in reality through consciousness, and so each one of us takes in a slightly different reality. We can blame some of this on Freud. Freud, working at the same time as the modern artists, was trying to understand where neuroses came from. He presented this in a model of the psyche in which only part of the psyche contains conscious thought, with unconscious thought responsible for a variety of behaviors and symptoms. We can also thank speed for some of the psychic disruptions of modernity. Transportation was faster, communication was faster, even getting a new shirt when yours started to wear out was faster. Many psychologists, and of course Stephen Kern, to whose work much of this lecture is indebted, believed that speed itself disoriented people, that people's bodies and minds were not able to adapt to new technology as quickly as it became available. So we can think of simultaneity as a way of talking about speed. Simultaneity, like speed, links people to one another. Now that grandmother's house is a short train ride away, you can visit her more often than when it was a 2-day carriage ride. But speed also alienates. It operates outside of human psychological adaptation and alienates us from one another and from our world. Simultaneity also connects to cinema, which worked so hard to develop a way to show simultaneous actions in a linear art form. And it relates to irony, which is a way of saying two things at once. Simultaneity promises human capability while showing that humans are subject to powerful forces they cannot control. For us, it's important to remember simultaneity is about a real material change in the world and in how people live their lives. But it is also a felt change, something that happens in each individual's own psyche and affects their way of interacting with the world. So what does this all mean for modernist aesthetic movements, which tried to capture the feeling of being a modern person? There are a few features common to modernist works. First, fragmentation, giving a story or image in parts rather than in a whole. Second, technical experiment. Modernist artists, whether writers, painters, architects, or musicians, did not know what would work in order to express the new feeling they had about the world. So they all experimented wildly, often with the most basic parts of their art form. Third, the use of irony. As we've said, irony allows you to say two or even more things at once, so irony is the most prevalent rhetorical mode of modernism. I usually tell my students that if they aren't sure what the answer to a question is in this class, irony will usually fit the bill. Fourth, a focus on the present. Modernists are also interested in memory because it is part of consciousness, and some modernists are very interested in predicting the way the terrific machines of modernism would lead us all to a new paradise. But the main thing they wanted to understand was the present, because the present itself seemed to have changed due to the things we've been talking about just now. Fifth, and completely related to the idea of the present, an interest in exploring consciousness. Consciousness is how we know we are in the present, and consciousness is how we take in everything reality offers us, as well as how we observe things we've stored in memory or things we imagine. Sixth, if modernists were usually ironic, they were also skeptical of the truths the past had delivered to them. In fact, They were discovering that many of those truths were not true at all, but were just expressions of power or convention or something else. So the moderns really wanted to discover and nail down what I call big T truth. Sadly, big T truth was elusive, because moderns recognize that the fact we take in reality through consciousness means that no two people have the same experience of reality. Really, even you yourself do not have the same experience of reality at all times, because sometimes you are thinking of something else and reality passes you by without your being aware of it. Like when you turn up at the store with no memory of driving there, because you were preoccupied with other thoughts. And finally, modernist texts are marked by multiplicity. We'll talk about this more when we talk about Cubism, but for now, it's enough to know that because moderns couldn't nail down big T truth, they tried to discover as many little t truths as they could, working under the assumption that the way to get to big T truth was to assemble all the little t truths in the world, a task they knew to be impossible. Thus, for modernists, the belief was not so much everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but rather none of us can ever have more than a little bit of the truth, and therefore none of us has the truth at all. You will need the Stephen Kern quotation in this slideshow for the informal essay. The citation information is here on this slide.